What's up, everyone? How you guys doing? And today we'll be talking about Sucrose, who I think is going to be a great investment for players going into Nod-Krai. Now, Sucrose has always been part of the Power 5, a term canonically used by players to describe 5 of the strongest 4 stars. And while these 5 characters have had their ups and downs, many of them has had very good peaks. We had Xingqiu doing Dendro, Fischl as well. Xiangling has always been good, and I think Bennett is a character that will never be power crap. However, when it comes to Sucrose, there's always been talks about her being a good character, but always replaceable, especially if you have Kazuha. But today, in this video, we'll talk about why she'll be good going into the new region. And so, without further ado, let's begin. Now, Sucrose is an anemo catalyst character, and these 2 traits actually give her a lot of value. Now, first and foremost, as a catalyst, this means that her normal and charged attacks are aligned to her element, and because she is anemo, this means that Sucrose is able to swirl about contact with a normal basic attack chain. This means that she can easily fulfill the conditions of her best in slot artifact set, which is the very distant vendor which we'll talk about later. And of course, swirl as transformative reaction will help out a lot going into Nod-Krai. But that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about her kit in itself. Her normal attack chain pretty standard. The one thing about her is that her normal and charged attacks both have separate ICDs or internal cooldowns. Basically, for most other characters, there's a certain amount of time that will pass before you can do like another reaction, whereas you can do these 2 simultaneously or consecutively, and you're able to swirl, which means you're able to use more of the buffs, stuff like that. At the same time, the elemental skill is just her throwing a wind spirit that's able to group enemies. Is pretty decent, especially in AoE content, and can also stagger enemies. And the elemental burst is basically a big version of the skill where you summon a large wind spirit or a crystal fly, and this can do pulses every 2 seconds. So at 6 seconds, if you have 3 pulses. But with C2, which I'll talk about later, the additional 4. At the same time, the Wind Spirit can absorb any of the pack elements, Pyro, Electro, Cryo, Hydro, and then you will do damage according to that element. Now, for the Ascension 1 passive, the Catalyst Conversion, basically whenever she triggers Swirl, all party members of the element that is swirled will have their EM increased by 50 for 8 seconds. So obviously, when you use normal attacks, it will be very helpful. If you use any of your skill or your elemental burst, it will definitely help to trigger this EM for the team. And then one more thing is that this can also stack, which means that if you swirl like Pyro first and then you swirl Electro, both buffs can exist for both elements at the same time. And then for the A4 passive, whenever you use your skill or your burst and it hits an enemy, all party members, excluding Sucrose and Kazuha, we'll talk about that later, that EM will increase by 20% of Sucrose's own EM for 8 seconds, which is why EM is a priority in her builds. Now, talking about Kazuha, she is the only character that is excluded from this because it will create an infinite buff and infinite power. So in the end, the devs decided to not do it because it will just make Kazuha too infinitely broken. So that's the one caveat. But for all other characters, yeah, they will get the 20% of Sucrose EM for 8 seconds whenever you use a skill or your elemental burst. And so when it comes to Sucrose level priorities, the main important thing first and foremost is to get her to max level, which for most cases will be level 90. And even if you have level 100 with the Masterless Stellar Fortuna, I don't think Sucrose will be a character you take up to level 100. So you want to take it as max level 90 as much as you can. And then for talents, burst, skill, normal attack, that's the way to go. But the scalings are not that important on her talent, right? Because it's more of her producing the transformative reactions, and so level 90 is the main priority. But if you really want to buff more of the damage, then you can obviously go for the burst, followed by the skill, and the normal attacks can be left at level 1. And so before we go into Sucrose artifacts and weapons and stuff like that, the reason why Sucrose is going to be very good as we've seen so far is that she's able to give a lot of bonuses to the team, especially with EM. We know that going to Nod-Krai, we're going to have 2 new reactions called Lunar Charge and Lunar Bloom, and these 2 reactions are transformative, which means that they definitely will benefit quite a lot from Sucrose giving EM to the team, especially through the A4 passive. Now, obviously, we'll talk about Constellations later. The C6 doesn't really help that much, at least for now, because the elemental damage bonus doesn't really affect Lunar Bloom and Lunar Charge damage. But with that being said, obviously we might see more lunar reactions in the future. But for now, especially with the opening few versions of Luna 1 or Nod-Krai, sorry, we'll definitely see a lot of value with Sucrose because of the amount of buffs that she gives, especially through her A for passive. So that's why Sucrose is going to be very good. And talking more about artifacts later, with the best in slot Viridescent Venerer, she will definitely be very good because even though elemental damage bonus doesn't work with transformative reactions, the elemental Red Shred does. So Sucrose, because she's anemo, is able to provide the extra value through that as well to make your Llama teams or your Flynn's teams or even your Ineffa teams hit a lot harder. And since we briefly mentioned our Constellations, I think we'll talk about this first because obviously as a 4-star character, getting Constellations is a lot easier. So let's talk about them. Right, the first one is the C1, which basically gives her a second charge of her skill, which is obviously very good in not only having more swirls, but having more grouping, having more damage, but also reduces her ER requirements. C2 is the one that increases her burst from 6 to 8 seconds, so 1 extra pulse is pretty alright, but not the most impactful. C3 and C5 are skill and burst constellations. C4 does help if you're playing Sucrose on field, and so if you're playing her on field, using her basic and charge attacks will reduce the cooldown of her skill, which is obviously very nice, right? As I mentioned, this is more helpful for an on-field Sucrose as compared to an off-field one, because obviously off-field you're just skill bursting and then you're bouncing, but it's obviously a very good one to weave in even as an off-field support. And lastly, with the chaotic entropy, it is okay. It's not really as game-changing as people think it is, because you have to swirl the right elements, and it can be a little bit inefficient to swirl with her elemental burst, so it's not something that players really are looking out for. And especially if you are using her in the teams that are transformative reaction based like Lunar Charge and Lunar Bloom, then this is really nothing that useful. And so generally the early Constellations and even C4 can be pretty nice, and so generally those are the ones that you aim for. This means that Sucrose doesn't need C6 to work. It can work off the bat, but especially her C1, it all gives very good quality of life to make her a lot better to play. And of course, when we talk about artifact sets, we've mentioned this multiple times, and I guess if you play Genshin Impact for a while, you will kind of know that as an anemo character, there's one go-to set that she will gravitate towards, and that is the Viridescent Venerer. 2-piece is pretty okay, but the 4-piece increases swirl damage and also reduces the elemental rest of the elements infused in the swirl by 40%, sorry, for 10 seconds. This is very good, but of course, if you want to have alternatives, there are things that you can consider. So first and foremost, if you're a newer player, having the instructor set can be pretty nice in giving EM, but generally you start to find that eventually as the game goes on, especially since you're playing in teams like the Lunar Charge and Lunar Bloom, where everyone has EM, it can get a little bit oversaturated, and then you will want to give them other buffs like Elemental Red Shred. But for a newer player, and even for teams where you find it hard to swirl with your Sucrose, for the Elemental Red Shred, for the 4-piece bonus, the instructor giving a lot of EM can be very useful in those situations. That being said, most people gravitate towards the Viridescent Venerer. You obviously do a combo of 2-piece EM, 2-piece ER if you need it, but one set that I want to talk about is not the Songs of Days Past, it's actually the Noblesse Oblige, which can be pretty okay. It's not really that good for Sucrose herself. It can be beneficial for the team, especially if you do not have anyone with the Noblesse set. That being said, in most cases, you would want to have Viridescent Venerer on Sucrose just for more, it's just better overall as an artifact set. And also, it's a lot more universal, whereas, the Noblesse cannot work on teams where they are not attack scaling like a Neuvillette team, for example. And then it goes to the main stats, very, very simple. You want as much ER as possible. So for the 3 main stats for the Sense, Goblet, and Crown, you will definitely want Elemental Mastery. And then for the substats, it's basically a combination of EM and ER. Basically, that's it. You want to hit your ER requirements. If you're off-fielder, about 160%. On-fielder is about 120 to 140. And of course, that depends if you have other characters in your team that have Favonius weapons or able to battery quite well. So for example, if you have like Ororon with like a Favonius bow, then obviously that will help with her ER requirements to lessen it down. It also helps a lot if you have the C1, as mentioned earlier. And of course, if Sucrose herself is using like a weapon like Favonius or sacrificial fragments. And so lastly, before we move on, let's talk about her weapons. Sucrose has two main playstyles, but I didn't really mention this earlier. One as an on-field anemo driver and one as an off-field soul support. Now, some weapons do overlap, but generally these there are some distinct weapons that you will use depending on your playstyle. Now, first and foremost, if you do have Mizuki's signature weapon, with the 5 of you, you can definitely use it on Sucrose. It is technically her best in slot if you have it, just for the crazy amounts of EM that it gives to her. At the same time, if you do have it as well, the heaters can be fine, but for an on-fielder, there's actually a better weapon called the sacrificial fragments. Not only does it give a lot of elemental mastery, but this weapon also helps to refresh her cooldown of a skill, which means more skill usage, less ER requirements, and more swirls. So generally, if you can, you most likely be using sacrificial fragments because of the utility over the minimal increase of strength from the healer's weapon. That being said, if you have the Wandering Even Star, can also be a very good option if the rest of the team is attack scaling. This will be likely the case if you're using her in a Flint's team in the future, or even if you're using like a vaporized like Sucrose national team. This can be a pretty good weapon to have, because obviously this also gives elemental mastery, but at the same time gives bonus attack to the team. So very good in giving more power, and as compared to a weapon like the Trading Tails, which we'll talk about later, is not as restrictive to use. And lastly, for an on-fielder, I think that the Magic Guide can be a pretty good one if you're starting out, but generally there are better options that you can replace with as you go through the game. Alright, so this came out after I finished recording the video, which are the Nod-Krai craftables. Black Marrow Lantern is the catalyst. This one is more for Bloom and Lunar Bloom. So for Sucrose to activate it, she needs to Swirl Hydro, which is obviously very inconsistent, so I wouldn't really like bank on this being very good. It can be helpful, but it can be also very conditional. So generally the current options are a lot better in an on-field version of Sucrose. Now, as an off-fielder, Sucrose can definitely make use of the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, especially if the main DPS on the team is attack scaling. Now, obviously, this does have a very bad uptime on the buff. It's buffed for 10 seconds, but can only occur every 20, which means it's a 10-second downtime. So depending on your team rotations, it can be a little bit wonky. And even if you're looking at like certain team comps, right, you can find that there are better ways to buff, especially if you have the Wandering Even Star. That being said, for how accessible it is a very good option if you have her as a source support. Just take note that you have to kind of play into the demands of the passive. That being said, any other weapon, for example like the Favonius Codex, that gives her ER for herself and the team, can be pretty nice. Although I would say that if you're using Favonius, I'd rather it on another character rather than Sucrose. You usually want to maximize your damage as much as possible through EM. So that's that. Obviously, you can still go with these sacrificial fragments. That'll be pretty okay. I wouldn't recommend Lali's weapon because it doesn't really do much besides a stat stick. And then, usually for catalyst characters, you can obviously go for the prototype Ember. But generally, if you want healing on the team, bring a healer in as one of your 4 characters instead of putting Sucrose with the prototype Amber. But generally for supportive, I would rather players have the Thrilling Tales or even the Hakushin Ring, which helps a lot if you're playing her in Electro Charge or Lunar Charge teams. But if you're using her with Lauma in Lunar Bloom, then it wouldn't be that beneficial, and I'd rather go with Thrilling Tales or even just use the sacrificial fragments instead. So this is another one of the new weapons coming in Nod-Krai that was announced after I recorded the video. This is the event weapon, I believe. They only have the Refinement 1 rank weapon stats. So we talk about this. This is the Ether Light Spindalute. Maybe I might pronounce it that wrong. So basically gives her ER requirements, gives her 46% ER, and also for 30 seconds after the skill, your equipping character gets 100 elemental mastery, which is obviously very nice. And this is an R1, so if it's at R5, it can be like her best slot for an off-field team. So yeah, that's really very nice, because obviously that EM can be shared with the rest of the team through her A for passive. That being said, there's some cases where you still rather have another weapon like Three Tails, but for ease of use, this can be an excellent option for off-field Sucrose going forward. And so before going to the teams, I want to talk about my thoughts on Sucrose. I think she's an excellent character, very, very underrated. Obviously, with the release of Kazuha, she has obviously fallen a bit to the side, but because she is more focused on elemental mastery, Sucrose does help out a lot in this upcoming new region as compared to Kazuha. Now, Kazuha needs to C2, but if you have a C2 Kazuha, obviously, you know, he can be a lot better. But that being said, Sucrose herself has a lot of value because of the amount of buffs that she can give, and also because of the way she's able to group enemies for a very, very low cost. Remember that Sucrose is not a character that requires C6, C1, or maybe even C4 for an on-fielder, and so it's relatively accessible for players who are newer to the game, or for low spenders or non-spenders as well. The one thing I'll say about Sucrose is that she has a issue that many early Catalyst characters have, which is the clunkiness of Catalyst characters. You know, this is something that you see in characters like Ningguang, Klee, so on and so forth, even like Yaimiko, where characters that are Catalyst tends to be a little bit more stationary when they're attacking, which means that group positioning is very, very important. And Sucrose is one of those characters as well. And also because Sucrose is the character that uses both her normal and charged attacks, especially as an on-fielder, you can feel a little bit uncomfortable to play when she's animation locked into abilities. And of course, it also means to use up more stamina when you're dodging, when trying to avoid attacks. That being said, obviously this doesn't matter if you play as an off-field support, but even so, it takes a while of learning. But as long as you are able to learn the positioning of Sucrose, which is basically where you're able to position yourself to hit as many targets as possible and stagger them, stuff like that, then you should have little issue in mastering the little alchemist. Is she an alchemist? Oh wait, she is an alchemist, ha. Okay, anyways, yeah. So without further ado, let's talk about teams. Alright, so let's talk about the two new reactions that will be coming in Nod-Krai, which obviously the first one is Lunar Bloom, which you can obviously activate right now with Ineffa, but even so in 6.0, you can do it with Flints. Now obviously with either character is going to be a lot different. In a team without Flints, you can play as an on-fielder. You can obviously also play another electro character like Cloran, or even Rider Shogun as an on-fielder. But let's say you're playing Sucrose as the on-field, you know, she's the one that's driving through reactions. I prefer Xingqiu as the Hydro character. While I think that Yelan and Furina's personal damage are higher, the buffs that they give are not as good because obviously their buffs do not work on transformative reactions. And so while they do a lot of damage themselves, they don't really buff the rest of the team. And I prefer Xingqiu not only because of its defensive utility, but it's also able to work very well with Ineffa because of her shield. So I think that for Xingqiu, being a more defensive option is a lot better. But I think that all three are still decent, but I just prefer Xingqiu in this team. Obviously, if you're playing her as an on-fielder, you will want to use Ororon. Just for the very good damage, and also Sucrose is able to trigger his Night Soul Blessing, the Hypersense, so that's going to be very nice. And obviously, of course, Ineffa is the one that makes it all happen, especially if you're using the new Lunar Charge reaction. But that's really about it. As mentioned, if you want to play, like, let's say for example, Cloran is an on-fielder, then Sucrose is going to be very good in buffing the personal damage of Cloran as well. So that's going to be that for the Lunar Charge variants. Now going over the Quick Bloom versions. Now obviously if you're using what's a character called Nilou, then you wouldn't use Sucrose at all. You would just use Nilou with Hydro and Dendro characters. But let's say you're playing her with like Hyper Bloom, right? And of course, you know, pretend this is Lauma. I don't have Lauma because Lauma's not out yet. But yeah, this is going to be a pretty good team where Sucrose is the one driving reactions. Sucrose is the one that's giving EM to the team. Sucrose is the one that's helping Swirl so that you know, the Xingqiu and the Cookie Shinobus are doing more damage. And while she doesn't really buff up Dendro damage, she's just helping everyone else do decent. And of course, with Llama in the future, this is going to be very good because Llama also shreds Dendro and hydro resistance. So just a lot of damage in total. And of course, Sucrose can be a very good driver for those teams, especially if you're not using Bloom with Nilou. Last but not least, you can also use the national teams. I know I said Child National here, but you know, it is what it is. Obviously, you can use Chow in this team, where Chow will be the on-fielder, and then Sucrose will be the off-fielder, providing swirls and support. That being said, you can also use a version of this with Xingqiu. Let me just find Xingqiu himself. Yeah, in a team like this, where Sucrose is driving reactions, he is driving the rain swords for Xingqiu, Xiangling is doing damage, Ben is buffing, and they're just going to do a lot more damage, especially when Sucrose is also sharing EM with the team and making the vaporize hit a lot harder. And of course, this is going to be very nice if Sucrose herself has the Trailing Tails that she's able to pass on to a character like Xiangling. Well, even if she uses like a weapon like Sacrificial Fragments, it's still going to be pretty nice in these team comps. So generally, even in the vaporized team comps, she can do very, very well. Obviously, you know, the only teams that you probably wouldn't want to use Sucrose in are, well, obviously Geo teams. But besides that, yeah, that's really about it. She can also be played with anemo DPSs like Shao to provide battery, but the EM really doesn't do that much. But it's still a pretty decent option nonetheless. But generally, these are the main options that you can go for. But the main highlights of all this would definitely be the character teams that are based on Lunar Charge and Lunar Bloom. So for this showcase that we're about to have, we will be using this team right over here, which is the Ineffa team with Xingqiu, Ororon, and Sucrose. And of course, you know, going forward with Flints, I think that Sucrose will be a more supportive off-field character, but will still provide decent damage overall. These are my Ineffa stats. Obviously, R5 deathmatch is unrelatable, but yeah, I mean, that's how it is. 2-piece attack, 2-piece elemental mastery, because I'm not going to farm a new set for her. That's going to happen in the next week. But yeah, these are her stats. She is at C0 with a 198 talent. And then when we go on to Xingqiu, same Xingqiu build as like previously for like the previous showcase, Sacrificial Sword with the emblem of Severed Fate. This is a pretty simple, pretty standard build for Xingqiu. And I do have him at Constellations 6. So this will be very nice for the rain swords. One's 12-12 because of C6. And then we have Ororon, who I believe I have at C2. Yes, I have it at C2. He's mainly there for ER. So he's not really the best build, right? He just has ER, Pavonius, Warbow, and stuff. He is on Cinder City. It's pretty okay. Obviously, the elemental damage bonus doesn't work for Lunar Charge, but it does help for personal damage. And also, it helps his energy requirements. So that's that. I'm too lazy to change it off him, so deal with it. So yeah, 188 for his talents. And then for Sucrose herself, right? So this is 884 EM, and then we do have 144 ER. A little bit high, but you know, I prefer high ER. Because I can get my burst off cooldown. We have the Sacrificial Fragments because the Blade is an on-fielder. And then for the artifacts, obviously Redison Venerer. I'll just show it once again for the stats. Just want some ER, EM. I'm not gonna lie to you. These are basically Kazuha's pieces. But you know, for this showcase, I think it'll be pretty nice. And these are the talents. And so we'll get to the showcase, and then we'll come back after it is done. So we'll see you at the end of it. And so that's that on Sucrose. I think she's going to be very, very good. She's going to be valuable when the new Nod-Krai region comes in, especially if you are picking up Flints. Now, going over to the new region, there'll definitely be characters that will overshadow her eventually. But for a starting point, especially with how easy it is to build Sucrose, how she's not constellation dependent, she will be a good option and even a very good second alternative for your team if you need them. So honestly, going to Nod-Krai, I think that Sucrose is a very good pickup for players who maybe have not built her up that much or have shown little investment into her in previous patches. I think that in this upcoming Nod-Krai, she would definitely be very good. She'll just be very, very, very good, mainly based on her EM sharing with the team, which makes the team do more damage. But the fact that she can also swirl and drive reactions also makes her very valuable. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you are building Sucrose, you're going to use her in Nod-Krai. I definitely am. So yeah, we're going to see how that turns out. With that being said, I thank you for watching this video. Like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Do know that I stream both on Twitch and on YouTube. Twitch link is down in the description below. Now, see you guys next time. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe, be good to yourselves and the people around you. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.